The sixth shot did not ricochet. At 2:27 p.m., on March 30th, 1981, John Hinckley Jr.'s final round struck Ronald Reagan squarely in the chest as the president raised his arm to wave, and 3 hours later, the surgeons at George Washington University Hospital could not save him. In the real history, that same .22 caliber bullet glanced off the armored panel of the presidential limousine before lodging an inch from Reagan's heart, and he lived to joke with his doctors and serve 8 transformative years. Here, the geometry was crueler by a fraction of an inch. The 70-year-old man, who had carried 44 states only months earlier, died on the operating table before the sun set on Washington. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The facts leading to that afternoon are not in dispute. Reagan had taken office on January 20, 1981, after defeating the incumbent Jimmy Carter. He had gone to the Washington Hilton to address a labor convention, and Hinckley, armed with a cheap revolver, had waited in the crowd near the exit. 6 shots in under 2 seconds wounded Press Secretary James Brady, Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, and a district police officer named Thomas Delahanty. All of that happened exactly as recorded. What changed was the angle of a single bullet, and with it, the entire shape of the decade to come. But what no one in that frantic emergency room understood, what would take years to fully measure, was that the conservative revolution had just lost the one man who could complete it. The chaos inside the West Wing was instant and constitutional. Within the hour, Secretary of State Alexander Haig strode before the cameras and declared, "I am in control here," a phrase that in the real timeline became a symbol of confusion during a crisis Reagan survived. Now those words landed in a country that had genuinely lost its president, and they rang not as reassurance but as overreach. Haig was wrong about the line of succession, and everyone in the room knew it. The Constitution did not place him near the presidency at all. George H.W. Bush, the vice president and former director of Central Intelligence, was aboard Air Force Two over Texas when the news reached him. He did not seize a microphone or improvise authority. He returned to Washington, and that evening, under the cold mechanics of the 25th Amendment, he was sworn in as the 41st President of the United States. It was the first permanent presidential succession the amendment had ever governed. The orderly transfer steadied a shaken government, but it also exposed the truth of the new era. The man who had spoken of a revolution was gone, and the man who replaced him had spent the 1980 primaries arguing against the very ideas Reagan rode into office. Bush inherited a mandate he had once mocked. During the 1980 Republican primaries, he had famously dismissed Reagan's supply-side program as voodoo economics, warning that deep tax cuts paired with a defense buildup would not balance themselves. Now that program was his to carry, and the conservative movement watched to see whether the skeptic would honor the dead president's vision or quietly bury it. The tax and budget agenda was already moving through Congress, championed by supply-side believers like Representative Jack Kemp, who pressed the new president to keep faith with what voters had been promised. Bush made a pragmatic choice. With James Baker installed as his chief of staff and the architect of his political strategy, the administration pushed the tax cuts through, but with a managerial caution that Reagan's true believers found unsatisfying. The rates came down. The rhetoric of an unstoppable revolution did not survive intact. Where Reagan would have framed each cut as a moral crusade against government itself, Bush framed it as sound fiscal adjustment, hedged against deficits he genuinely feared. The supply-side wing got most of its policy and almost none of its poetry, and the gap between what was passed and what had been promised would widen for years. The Pentagon's expansion went forward, but the volume came down. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger remained the fierce advocate of rearmament he had always been, defending the planned military buildup against every budget hawk who questioned it. Yet Bush's instincts were those of a manager and an intelligence professional, not a crusader. He had run the CIA. He understood the Soviet adversary as a system to be measured rather than an empire to be denounced. The buildup proceeded: new ships, new missiles, a larger budget, but the scale was trimmed and the language softened. There was no soaring talk of an evil empire on the horizon, no rhetorical campaign designed to convince Moscow that America's resolve was boundless. Bush preferred to let capability speak quietly. To allies, it looked like steadiness. To the conservatives who had wanted a moral confrontation with communism, it looked like a revolution losing its nerve. Then came the test that would define his first year. In December 1981, the Polish government under General Wojciech Jaruzelski declared martial law and crushed the solidarity movement that had been building across the country. Brezhnev's Soviet Union watched approvingly from Moscow, where the war in Afghanistan still ground on. A president inclined toward moral confrontation might have seized the moment to denounce the entire Soviet order. Bush did not. He responded with measured sanctions, targeted economic pressure, and careful coordination with European allies who depended on Soviet gas. It was diplomacy by calibration rather than thunder. The solidarity activists in their prison cells received American sympathy, but not an American crusade. Whether a louder response would have changed Poland's fate is impossible to know. What is certain is that the world saw a different kind of American leadership, cautious, institutional, and reluctant to gamble, and the consequences of that temperament would echo through the decade. But first, the movement that had lost its leader began to come apart. Deprived of Reagan's voice, the conservative coalition fractured. Reagan had been the rare figure who held together the supply-side economists, the cold warriors, and the social conservatives through sheer force of personality and conviction. He spoke to each faction in its own language and made them believe they were one army. Bush could not. He was respected, but he was not beloved by the movement's base, and he had never pretended to share all its certainties. Jack Kemp and the supply-siders grumbled that the revolution had been domesticated. The religious right, which had expected a champion, found a president who treated their priorities as one constituency among many. The result was not collapse but drift. The Republican Party remained in power, yet it governed as a coalition of managers rather than a movement of believers. Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker worked to hold a fragile GOP majority together, while Speaker Tip O'Neill's Democrats probed every fracture. The grand realignment Reagan had seemed to promise softened into something more ordinary. And then came the moment that should have defined everything that followed. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to lead the Soviet Union, a reformer searching for a Western partner bold enough to imagine the end of the Cold War. In the real history, he found that partner in Reagan, and the chemistry between the two men, the actor-turned-ideologue and the communist reformer, produced summits at Geneva and Reykjavik that reshaped the world. Here, Gorbachev met a different American. Bush was experienced, knowledgeable, and genuinely skilled in foreign affairs, but he was not transformational. He distrusted grand gestures and preferred verification to vision. The thaw still came, because the forces driving it ran deeper than any two men, but it advanced through cautious diplomacy rather than personal conviction. There were no dramatic walks in the woods, no electrifying offers to abolish nuclear weapons. The relationship was professional, productive, and slow. The Cold War wound down, but as a process managed rather than a partnership forged. No single decision settled its outcome, and no single leader could claim to have ended it alone. History remembered Ronald Reagan as a martyr of unrealized promise. He became the president who might have been frozen at the height of his appeal, his revolution forever suspended at the moment of its greatest momentum. The biographies dwelt not on what he did, but on what he was about to do. And in that absence, his legend grew larger than any record could have. Every disappointment of the years that followed was measured against the eloquent ghost of what he might have built. The conservative era still arrived, but it took a more moderate managerial shape than the one Reagan envisioned. The tax cuts endured. The Soviet Union still fell. Yet the decade carried the cautious fingerprints of George H.W. Bush rather than the crusading certainty of the man he replaced. It is tempting to believe that one personality could have bent the entire arc of the Cold War, and it is just as easy to forget how much was already in motion before that afternoon at the Hilton. The truth lies somewhere in the space between. A fraction of an inch decided who would govern. What it could not decide was whether any single man, however gifted, truly commands the forces of his age, or merely rides them for a while, and is remembered for the ride.